Hi and welcome to A British Audiophile, and if you don't know me already, my name is Taryn. Now I'm going to review the speakers that you see behind me today on the stands, the Acoustic Energy AE300s. But if you just indulge me for a moment, I want to talk about another speaker, the BBC LS3 5A, perhaps the most iconic British speaker of all time. What's the deal with that speaker? It's been some 46 years since it was first launched in 1975. And it still has a very strong and loyal following to this day from certain audiophiles. And it costs quite a bit of money these days depending on the variant that you choose, circa £2,000 or £3,000. And to tell the truth, it isn't the last word in technical performance at that price. There's other speakers that will dig deeper and reveal more of the recording. The LS3 5A is a little soft in the bass, a little rolled off at the highs. But it's about the mid-range performance. It's, I was going to say perfectly natural, but it isn't perfectly natural. It's fairly natural with an added degree of body and warmth. And I think it's the reason why it's so appealing. It produces vocals and acoustic instruments that are slightly idealized, the ideal way you'd like them to sound as opposed to perhaps the way they are originally on the recording. And that's its particular appeal. So why am I talking about a £2,000–3,000 speaker when what I'm reviewing today doesn't really have much resemblance on the surface? It's a very different type of design. It's ported as opposed to a sealed box, and it has modern aluminium drivers, and it retails for just under £600, not £2,000–3,000. Well, it shares a number of tonal characteristics. So if you can't run to £2,000–3,000 for an LS3 5A and it's been on your wish list, you may want to watch this review. Now, just before we get into the ribs of things, I just want to say this. My product of the year last year was the Acoustic Energy AE1 active speakers. So that has the amplifier and the crossovers built in, and it's largely based on the design of this speaker, the AE300s. So it'd be interesting to see how this passive speaker at £600 and a good amplifier around £400, which I happen to have in the IOTA VX SA3, so how that combination compares to the AE1 actives. The Acoustic Energy AE300s are 300mm high, 175mm wide and 260mm deep. That makes them slightly slimmer and slightly deeper than the AE1 actives that I reviewed. They're available in a piano black finish, a piano white finish and the real walnut finish that I have here today. It's a real premium finish on these speakers that's normally associated with speakers at a much higher price point. Just look at the quality of the veneers, how tight the tolerances are on the edges of the panels, and those beveled edges are a nice touch as well. The cabinet is very inert, made from 18mm MDF, and it's internally braced, which means that this speaker is very good with the knuckle wrap test. Although the AE1 actives were largely based on this speaker, there are differences in the drivers, but I'll get into that later. The tweeter is a 28mm aluminium cone. That's a little larger than the ubiquitous 25mm. A larger tweeter normally helps with power handling and helps it to play a little bit lower, taking some of the demand off the woofer. The trade-off is normally that it doesn't have as good off-axis performance, but to help this particular tweeter, it's housed in a waveguide which helps to narrow its dispersion to better match the dispersion of the woofer at the top of the woofer's range. The woofer itself is a 130mm ceramic coated aluminium cone. It makes it quite stiff while still being relatively light, and that means that it has good pistonic motion and helps it to lower distortion. Now, I've introduced this new section to my reviews. Those of you who are regular viewers of this channel will know that I like to scratch a little bit below the surface, but I appreciate not everybody wants to sit here and watch me get my geek on. So if you want to skip this section, I won't be offended. There'll be a timestamp somewhere along here. The crossover has a second order filter on the woofer. That's a 12 dB per octave slope, and a third order filter on the tweeter. That's an 18 dB per octave slope. Now that did strike me as being a little bit unusual. Normally I'd expect the same order filter on both, so effectively they cross over and are a mirror image of each other. I did question Acoustic Energy's creative director about this, and he explained it like this. He said, well, that is a good place to start from a textbook standpoint, and certainly useful for DIY speaker builders where they have a limited degree of measurements that they can take, perhaps the on-axis measurement and a couple of off-axis measurements. What Acoustic Energy have to do is see how that driver behaves in multiple axes, in general how it's loading the room with sound, and sometimes it's necessary to deviate from those slopes in order to get a smoother integration between the two drivers. The 300 passives have a different woofer cone profile to the AE1 actives. It's flatter on the 300 passives. Now, the reason is that on the AE1 actives, they were able to get away with a steeper woofer cone profile. The benefit of that is that it has better dynamics because of improved pistonic behavior. Now, there's always engineering trade-offs. The downside is that by having that steeper profile, it suffers from breakup nodes earlier on. So breakup nodes are an unpleasant kind of distortion that happen as a woofer plays higher up its frequency range. Metal cone drivers are particularly problematic in this particular regard. On the AE1 actives, they were able to cost effectively implement a fourth order crossover on the woofer, so that woofer's out of there well before the breakup nodes start to display themselves. That wasn't an option on the passives because a fourth order crossover network on a passive design is going to have a negative impact on the sound unless it's a really good quality crossover, and that's going to cost quite a bit of money, so it wasn't really an option at this price point. I mentioned the classic BBC LS3 5A at the beginning of this review, and I'm not suggesting that this Acoustic Energy AE300s at a quarter of the price offer the same level of performance. They don't. But it does have a very similar overall tonal characteristic. This is a warm, lush, smooth sounding speaker, and it's a little soft in the bass, a little rolled off in the highs, and that lush and warm character comes through in the mid-range. The upper mid-range is ever so slightly recessed a little, and that takes the edge of harsh and bright recordings. Now, Acoustic Energy did this on purpose. They found that a lot of the amplifiers that this speaker is likely to be partnered up with in and around the £500 price point have a slightly thin sounding mid-range and have a few rough edges, and in order to fill out that mid-range and smooth off those edges, they gave it this tonal characteristic. Now, I'm not going to dispute that because quite a lot of the solid state amplifiers around this price point do have that tonal characteristic. And I'll talk a little bit more in the next section about how it paired up with my IOTA VX SA3. But for now, I can say this. This is a speaker like a baby LS3 5A that sounds quite glorious with acoustic and vocal performances. It's not the last word in dynamics, speed, or clarity at this price point. And if you like to listen to rock music or big orchestral works, this isn't the speaker for you. So let's do a couple of quick comparisons. My PSB Imagine Minis are also a mini monitor that retailed for £600 until they were discontinued last year. Now, that may be a speaker that many of you may not be aware of, and I never really understood why it wasn't more popular because I still think it's one of the finest mini monitors produced for less than £1,000. So the PSB is a smaller speaker with what I assume is a 4-inch circa 100mm woofer cone. Being a smaller speaker, it's a little less dynamic than the Acoustic Energies, although I don't think it's particularly far behind in this regard, and that's because the PSB is quite a punchy little speaker given its size. But the bass does roll off quite a bit sooner at around 60 Hz. It extends down to the mid-40s on the Acoustic Energies. In every other regard, from a technical standpoint, the PSB is the superior speaker. It's much cleaner and more open sounding with a more neutral tonal balance. But the warm, rich nature of the Acoustic Energy means that you can listen to it for long periods of time without any listening fatigue, and it is a lot more forgiving of partnering equipment, which I can talk a little bit more about in the next section. So the other comparison that I quickly want to do is with the Acoustic Energy AE1 Actives that retail for £1,000. The question is, can I take the £600 passive Acoustic Energy AE300s and combine it with a £400 amplifier, a really good £400 amplifier, something like the Iota VX SA3, and get close to the performance of the AE1 Actives? And the answer is no. Now, I'm not being overly critical of the Iota VX SA3 or the AE300s. They're both fine sounding products at their price, but the Actives take performance to an entirely different level. There's greater clarity, greater dynamics, greater grip and control, and the overall tonal balance is much more neutral. And even if you combine the AE300s with more expensive amplification, something like my Hagel H160, you still don't quite get there. Now, if you can just take the Acoustic Energy AE1s out of your mind for a second, because they really are a different kettle of fish, and consider the AE300s as a fine sounding passive speaker for £600 that partners really well with inexpensive amplification. Guess what happened when I partnered it with the Iota VX SA3 that retails for £400? Now, the Iota VX SA3 is a fairly neutral sounding amplifier for the money, but as Acoustic Energy correctly pointed out, what's typical of amplifiers around this price is that it does have a slight leanness in the mid-range and a few rough edges. I partnered it with the AE300s, and guess what? That mid-range filled out nicely and those rough edges were smoothed over. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't a combination that's going to appeal to rock enthusiasts. This isn't the speaker for them. But those people who listen to softer music, whether it's soul, blues, jazz, and particularly people who listen for long periods and at low levels, there was a real synergy between these two components. And in particular, the way that acoustic instruments and vocals were presented were highly alluring. In terms of how you'd set these speakers up in a room, I did find that the AE300s were quite forgiving of room positioning. Like most speakers though, they benefit from being away from walls. Now, ideally you'd like to maintain the 85 centimeters that I've spoken about in other videos, that's circa 3 feet. If you can't get away with that, you probably get away with something around half a meter, 2 feet. I wouldn't go any closer than that. They are a little soft in the bass, and pulling them away from the wall did tighten that bass up quite a bit. The other thing is that they're a little bit rolled off at the top end as well, so I had them towed in quite aggressively with the tweeters almost directly on axis pointed towards my ears. This is a pretty tricky speaker to sum up. It's not the last word in speed, clarity or dynamics at its price point. Don't get me wrong, it's not poor in this regard, just not class leading. Rock enthusiasts, you're better off with something like a B&W 606. But there's a bunch of people out there who listen to softer music, and those people in particular who enjoy acoustic instruments and vocal presentations are going to be very well served with this speaker. Dare I say it? A bit like a BBC LS3 5A. Well, I've said it a bunch of times already in this review. And it's this Marmite character is going to be the reason why it gets recommended from this channel. It's going to appeal to some people and not to others. It's a pretty easy speaker to live with. It's easy on the eye. You don't normally get a speaker at this price point with this kind of finish, and it's forgiving of partnering equipment and forgiving of recordings. So I think for the right kind of listener, it's going to make them very happy. So that's it for my review of the Acoustic Energy AE300s. Hopefully you've liked the review. If you have, please hit that like button, please share it. And if you like what I do with this channel and you haven't subscribed already, please think about subscribing. But for today, for now, a British audiophile signing off.